headline of the New York Times read, "Nazi saboteurs face stern army justice." It was July 4th, 1942, and 8 Nazi agents had been caught on American soil with plans to sabotage economic targets and demoralize the population. 2 4-man squads had come ashore in Long Island and Florida aboard stealthy submarines. Hitler himself had authorized the plan to mirror a similar feat perpetrated in France during World War I. But the FBI thwarted the plot as the men were about to blow up a critical railway bridge and found enough explosives to operate for 2 years. The other side of the story would come to light decades later, and it would prove that it was not the FBI that gave away the enemy's intent, but rather an act of treason. Unlawful war. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 that decisively declared war on the United States, the FBI became highly alert on any schemes within American soil. Unbeknownst to the Americans, Hitler authorized a sabotage mission to attack civilian targets within the United States and demoralize the country. Operation Pastorius was directed against strategic economic targets and named after Francis Daniel Pastorius, the leader of the first organized German settlement in the U.S. The operation was headed by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who had taken part in the sabotage of French installations of Morocco during World War I, when other German agents entered the U.S. and planted bombs in New York's arms factories, destroying the munition supplies at Black Tom Island in 1916. Canaris hoped that Operation Pastorius would have the same success. A new batch of saboteurs was recruited among longtime German-U.S. residents. Lieutenant Walter Kappa was put in charge, and he began recruiting spies in 1941. Kappa had lived in Chicago and New York in the 1930s before returning home to serve the Reich. 8 German citizens who had previously lived in the U.S. were selected. Ernest Berger and Herbert Haupt were actually American citizens. George John Dosch, the oldest of the group at 39, had been a waiter for a long time in New York and even served in the U.S. Army. The rest of the gang were Edward John Curling, Richard Quirin, Heinrich Harm Heink, Hermann Otto Neubauer, and Werner Thiel, all of whom had worked different jobs in America. All agents were offered attractive salaries, exemption from military service, and respectable jobs when Germany won the war. They were then given 3 weeks of intensive sabotage training at the German High Command School in the Queens Lake Estate near Berlin. They were also instructed in the manufacture and use of explosives, incendiaries, and primers. A protocol to prevent defection was put into place, and anyone could put down a traitor instantly and without compunction. Fake background stories were also carefully woven for the saboteurs, including counterfeit birth certificates, social security cards, draft deferment cards, and driver's licenses. The agents were encouraged to speak English and read American newspapers and magazines to hone the language and become familiar with current events and culture. They were also given about $175,000 in cash. Kappa's plan was to send the group beforehand and meet them in Chicago, where he'd direct the operations. A secret mission. The operation's main objective was to stage attacks on economic targets like the hydroelectric plants at Niagara Falls, the aluminum company of America's plants in Illinois, Tennessee, and New York, a cryolite plant in Philadelphia, and Hellgate Bridge in New York, among others. A secondary mission, but no less important, was to terrorize civilians by planting explosives in public spaces like bridges and railroad stations. In late May, the 2 submarines sailed from Lorient, France, and headed to the American East Coast. But even before the mission had officially begun, the plans were already compromised. Dosch had left sensitive documents on a train, while one of the men had gotten drunk and publicly announced at a bar in Paris that he was a secret agent. U-Boat 202, the first submarine, arrived at Amagansett, Long Island, 100 miles east of New York City, on June 12, 1942. It was crewed by Dosch, Berger, Quirin, and Heink. The men came ashore in German Nazi uniforms so that they could be granted prisoner of war status if captured. As they disembarked from their raft, Young and unarmed Coast Guardsman John C. Cullen spotted them and demanded they stop. But Dash went for him and grabbed his arm, yelling, quote, "Take this and have a good time. Forget what you've seen here." He gave the young man a $260 bribe. The guard feigned cooperation, but then raced back to the station to report the encounter. Meanwhile, the Germans buried their extensive primers, incendiaries, and explosives to retrieve them later. They then put on civilian clothes and buried their uniforms too. When the armed patrol arrived at the site, the Germans were gone, but they found the buried equipment and confirmed Cullen's story. The Germans had taken the railroad into Manhattan, and after their arrival, the squad split into two pairs and checked into different hotels. The second submarine, U-584, arrived at Ponte Vedra Beach in Florida, south of Jacksonville, 4 days later. The 4 Germans on board were wearing bathing suits and German Navy hats, but they soon changed into civilian clothes and also buried their equipment. They then headed into Jacksonville and split 2 days later to cover Chicago and Cincinnati. Both teams were meant to meet at a hotel in Cincinnati to coordinate the sabotage operation, but they were unaware that they were about to be betrayed. Disloyalty. Dash checked into the same hotel as Berger and called him into his room. The leader said they needed to talk, and in case of disagreement, quote, "Only one of us will walk out that door. The other will fly out this window." Dash then confessed that he had no intention of going on with the mission, adding that he despised Nazism and planned to report the operation to the FBI. He did not want to return to Germany and hoped to stay in the US and resume the life he had started when he first came to America in 1922 as a stowaway, planning to remain in the country with his Pennsylvania wife. Berger agreed, and they decided to defect immediately to the US. On June 15th, Dash phoned the FBI office in New York and told them that he had information about German infiltrators, quote, "I'll be in Washington within the week to deliver it personally to J. Edgar Hoover." The agency had received several pranks after the war broke out and initially believed that this was another one. But when the same office got a call from the Coast Guard recounting the events in Long Island and finding the explosives on the beach, they realized the seriousness of the case. Days later, the group leader took a train to Washington and strolled into the FBI headquarters. Dash attracted the attention of Assistant Director D.M. Ladd, showing him the $84,000 in cash that he carried to perpetrate terrorist attacks during the following years. Except for Berger, none of the remaining 6 men knew of the betrayal, and they were arrested within 2 weeks. The men had not yet caused any harm, but when the news broke out, it caused public alarm. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover didn't mention that Dash had turned them in and gave credit to the agency for cracking the spy ring. A civilian court would be too lenient, so President Roosevelt created a military tribunal for the prosecution, the first after Lincoln's assassination. The scenario was stage-managed to portray the FBI as the protector of America, fighting the enemy back home while the servicemen fought overseas. The information given to the press described the capture as impeccable police work, and it was depicted as such in the propaganda newsreels broadcasted at the time. Meanwhile, Dash's involvement was barely mentioned, and he was expected to get clemency for alerting the authorities, but they were more concerned about their triumphant public image. The defendant's lawyers sought to take the case to a civilian court, but the Supreme Court rebuffed the petition. The 8 men pleaded not guilty, arguing that they only wanted to return to their families in America. Still, they were all charged with violation of the law of war. The trial ended in August, and the spies were sentenced to death by the electric chair. Aftermath. Roosevelt commuted Berger's sentence to life in prison and Dash's to 30 years because they had turned themselves in and revealed the German plan. The rest were executed on August 8, 1942, by electric chair. A few decades later, the National Socialist White People's Party placed an unauthorized monument in honor of the executed spies in a thicket on a National Park Service area in Washington. It remained unknown for decades until it was removed in 2010. The operation's failure led Hitler to rebuke Admiral Canaris, and no other sabotage attempt was directed against the US until 1944 with Operation Elstar. That mission involved 2 spies who arrived in Maine to gather information about manufacturing and the technical progress in America. When they were caught, they benefited from the current war situation and got prison sentences rather than execution. In 1948, President Truman granted executive clemency to Dasch and Berger, who were deported to the American zone of occupied Germany. But the men were never welcomed back and were always regarded as traitors who caused the death of their comrades. Dasch's lawyer applied for his client's amnesty for years. President Truman eventually leaned toward pardon, but Hoover always argued against it. Their freedom relied on the condition of deportation. Dasch settled with his wife and started a small business, but local news exposed him and forced the couple to flee and start over in another town. For years, Dasch petitioned pardon to return to the U.S., but Hoover blocked the request every time. Berger perished in 1975 and Dasch in 1992 without ever receiving the promised pardon in exchange for their cooperation. Thank you for watching our videos. Please subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels for more historical anecdotes and events. And don't forget to like this video and leave us a comment.